Hello and welcome to the Mile End Institute at Queen Mary University of London. My name is Robert Saunders, and today we have the last in our series on the future of British democracy. So far in this series, we have explored the future of the House of Lords, the reform of the civil service, likely changes to judicial review, and the role of corruption in the British state. But today we are addressing a much more fundamental question, which is how can democracy respond to the challenge of climate change? So we'll be asking whether national democracies focused on the next electoral cycle are capable of handling a long-term cross-border issue of this kind. We'll ask whether our own democracy is up to the task, or whether we need new kinds of democratic decision-making, like citizens' juries or climate assemblies. We'll be thinking about the role of protest in a democratic society, about how democracies engage with science, and about the impact of populism on climate action. To help us to think about these issues, we're joined today by a really stellar panel, each of whom has engaged with climate action in different kinds of democratic settings, whether that's in cabinet, or in parliament, or in the European Parliament, or in the Climate Assembly, or by thinking about it as a philosophical and political question. I'll introduce each of our panelists in turn, and then each of them will make some introductory remarks, which I'll then follow up very briefly. And we'll then open it out to a wider panel discussion. And at that point, I'll put some of your own questions to the speakers. So if you would like to put a question or make a comment, please use the chat box or the Q&A function, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the event. You can also tweet your question by using the hashtag #MEIClimateChange. So our first speaker is Hilary Benn. As the Labour MP for Leeds Central, he has served as Shadow Foreign Secretary and most recently as Chair of the Parliamentary Select Committee for Exiting the European Union. Perhaps most relevantly for our discussion today, from 2003 to 2007, he was Secretary of State for International Development. And then from 2007 to 2010, he was Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. So he brings to this discussion an experience of engaging with climate issues from inside the Cabinet. So thank you very much for joining us today, Hilary Benn. We look forward very much to hearing what you have to say.
Well, Robert, thank you very much for your kind invitation to join what I've just learned is the last in a series of, sounds like, very interesting discussions on the future of British democracy. Look, climate change clearly presents a huge challenge to our society, our world, and therefore to our democracies and the way in which they operate. We are facing a crisis, there's no question about that whatsoever, but its consequences are are unfolding over time rather than appear in an instant as COVID-19 did over a year ago. And therefore the question is, how do we get our country, our world, our democracies to respond in the same way to what is a much bigger threat? And I think it's really striking to reflect on the things that governments around the world, including here in the UK, have done and been able to do in the face of the COVID crisis, because it reminds us of what we can do in an emergency, and we are facing a climate emergency, and that can bring about quite significant change that otherwise people would have said it's not possible. Someone was making a point, I think, this morning that air travel, no, I was reading, that was it, the figures on air travel passengers through Heathrow down 92% compared with a year ago. And the person who was writing the article said, well, if you can do that to fight COVID, couldn't you do that to reduce CO2 emissions from aviation? Discuss. The main point I wanted to make is that I think we've got to use our democratic system to do this and not to try and find ways of bypassing it. And I say that in part in the interest of provoking discussion, because some have argued, and you alluded to it in your introduction, that our democracy is somehow incapable of taking the necessary decisions because it is irredeemably focused on the short term, and therefore the responsibility must be given to somebody else to do that. When it comes to climate, there have been various proposals, climate assemblies, and so on and so forth. Now, I do not decry the importance of assemblies, citizens' juries, to consider options and policies and to build support for the steps that we need to take. But I do not think that that can be a substitute for making our democracy do its job. Because however decisions are made, those who make them have to be held to account. They will be questioned on their policies and they will be criticised. And of course, the fundamental element of our democracy is if we don't like what the current government is doing, then we have the ability to say thank you very much and elect somebody different. And I've never quite understood how a citizens' assembly in the model some people have proposed, which would take decisions and present them to government, would submit itself to the essentials of democratic scrutiny and accountability. And behind that argument is of course the charge that we can't take decisions for the long term. And I'm the first one to recognize the pressures, the short-term pressures that our democracies face. But I think if we look back, I don't think that that is correct. Now, because I was the International Development Secretary at the time, I took part in turned out to be a famous meeting in Downing Street in the Cabinet Room with the then Prime Minister Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Miliband, who was the Environment Secretary, and one or two others, where we decided that we were going to have a Climate Change Act in the United Kingdom before we had fully agreed what it was going to contain. Now, why did that happen? It happened because that was an example of political leadership from the top of government, but it was combined with the pressure from below that had come from Friends of the Earth's Big Ask campaign that they were running at the time. And it showed how the two things can come together. And as a result, the United Kingdom passed the first climate change bill in the world. I was the Secretary of State when it was introduced into the House of Commons. It's put a framework in place. It has independent scrutiny in the form of the Climate Change Committee. It in effect marks the progress that the government of the day is making or isn't making. And I think it showed what political leadership inside our democratic system can do, provided you have the right leadership. And therefore, I think we can see how the political system can respond. And Caroline and I don't know if Caroline's yet been able to join us, we together sit on the IPPR Environmental Justice Commission, where we're grappling with a number of these questions. The second thing I would say is that we have now set a net zero objective, and we can argue about how quickly we should achieve that. But as Caroline, unfortunately, will have heard me say many, many times, I see the task now as making the changes and taking the steps that are necessary to get there. Because in one way, measuring progress in achieving net zero is quite easy to do, because you count your emissions every year and say, how are we doing? Are we on track? Are we behind? Are we ahead? And it is the contribution that different practical steps that need to be taken can make that will get us to a net zero carbon future. And let's take the practical examples. We have about 18 million homes that depend on gas boilers and gas cookers for heating and cooking. They are all going to have to come out and be replaced. Now, are they going to be replaced with heat pumps powered by electricity? Are they going to be replaced by hydrogen? Well, we will see, but there's a lot of work going on both fronts at the moment. which includes technical innovation. What is government's role in this? Government's role is to set a policy. So there's discussion going on at the moment about the date by which all new gas boilers in this country produced must be hydrogen ready. Now, that is a practical step that we are going to need to take if that's where the need to get to net zero is going to take us leads. And then we need to make the boilers, opportunity for job creation, and we need to fit them, and we need to grapple with the challenge of how do we pay for them in those circumstances. And we see the power that government decision and regulation and policy can result in. A really good example is offshore wind energy. Now, we have fantastic potential, particularly demonstrated at the moment with the high winds we're seeing around the country. Look at the amount of offshore wind generation that has developed in a generation in the United Kingdom because of policies that governments put in place. And I make that point because this is the final one, is this, that I think we have no choice but to be optimistic about our capacity to do this. And I also think that progress, painfully slow though it is, shows that progress is possible. And the reason I make that point is because if we, in the end, fall prey to the argument, and I've heard it from some people, well, it's too late, we're all doomed. I'm afraid that doesn't act as an incentive either to politicians or to the public to get on with this. I think it is doable. We're going to need all of the means at our disposal in order to get there. And we have to not give up on making our democratic system, our structures, our elected representatives, who after all are the People's Assembly, do their job together with us doing our job and businesses and others to achieve a net zero future. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I start by asking you about the point you raised about environmental justice?
Yes.
Because when you were Environment Secretary, you warned in a number of speeches that the global response to climate change mustn't exacerbate inequalities, whether that was between rich and poor nations or indeed within nations like the United Kingdom. So given the need to build democratic consent for these measures, and given that equality is itself a democratic principle, how do we balance the urgent need to act against ensuring that the costs are not all borne by the Rust Belt worker or the person on a low income, or indeed the poorer countries of the world?
Well, that is a really good question. And I can now see Caroline. That's what we're discussing on the commission that we are co-chairs of. Because, of course, what is now the fast developing world says, when I led the UK delegation to the climate negotiations in 2007, people would say, look, it's all very well you lecturing us. You've had all the benefits of carbon-based development, and then suddenly you turn around and say, oops, you can't have it now because the world can't cope. And that is a fair point about injustice and inequity. But at the same time, it's not really the point, because there are the existing emissions out there in the atmosphere, and they're being added to by countries as they industrialize. And therefore, we've moved beyond in the international negotiations between saying there's a group of countries who have particular obligations and they've got to do it first, and then we'll turn our attention to the rest later. We've all got to act, because if we don't, we're all going to be impacted by the danger of runaway climate change. I think that is the first point. Secondly, the transfer of resources is really important. But I remember a conversation I had with the Indian energy minister at the time, and I raised the subject of carbon capture and storage. Now, I know there's a lot of debate about this. And he said to me, well, that's all very interesting. But at that time, he said 40% of our citizens don't have any of that. He pointed to the lights in the ceiling. He said, my job is to give it to them. And at that time, how was India producing almost all of its electricity? By burning rather dirty brown coal. So the other point I would make is that I think the development of technology is going to be part of this. And I know that's a subject of great debate, because some people say well, if you just rely on technology to not do the difficult things, you're not going to get round to it. But that's why I said earlier, we're going to need every single bit of the means at our disposal to tackle this. But ultimately, when people turn up at climate negotiations, the credibility of the argument that you make is above all judged by what you're doing at home to play your part. Because ultimately, governments are responsible for what happens in their own country. And there's lots of other things that I could say, but I've said far too much already, and you need to turn to the other panelists.
Well, thank you. There's certainly lots of issues there that I think we'll return to later in the discussion, but that got us off to a wonderful start. So our second speaker is Caroline Lucas. Caroline has been the Green Party MP for Brighton Pavilion since 2010, which makes her the only representative of the Green Party ever to win a seat in the House of Commons. She also served in the European Parliament, so she has experience of two different kinds of parliamentary institution. She led the Green Party from 2008 to 2012 and was its co-leader from 2016 to 2018. So it's wonderful to be able to welcome you to the Mile End Institute. Thank you for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's a delight to be able to join you this afternoon, and a real pleasure to follow my colleague and IPPR Commission co-chair, Hilary Benn. So my starting point for this debate is that I don't believe that we can succeed in tackling the climate emergency without a thriving democracy, but nor do I believe that democracy can survive a failure to keep the climate safe. We keep them both or we lose them both. There are two important lessons, I think, for meeting this challenge that can be drawn from our current experience with the COVID pandemic. The first is to pay early attention to the science. We knew that a pandemic of this kind was coming. Even so, when it came, governments, including our own, were completely unprepared. There's a whole library of global and national reports that had forecast something like this for years. Governments had even carried out exercises to practice a response. Yet when it came, they flailed and fumbled. And it's only because of the brilliance of our scientists that we now have vaccines that will allow us to return to some version of normality. And that same scientific brilliance has been warning us about climate change for decades, and governments are still not ready. And as we work towards the Vital Climate Summit in Glasgow in November, governments are still not doing enough to deliver the targets set in Paris 5 years ago. You'll have seen horrifying figures from the UN that were released last month that concluded that 75 new or updated NDCs, those are the each nation's planned emissions reductions, if you added up what had been submitted so far, they would result in only around a 1% cut in emissions by 2030, not the 45% required by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Our own government isn't doing enough either, and despite being hosts of COP26, we're not on target to meet either the legally binding fourth or fifth carbon budgets, and plans like building the first deep coal mine in 30 years are doing very little to enhance our credibility. So clearly ministers are not listening to the science. But the second more hopeful lesson, I think, from the response to the pandemic is that we can rely much more than governments often think on the depth of common decency that is such a powerful characteristic of people who live on these islands. Despite political leadership that was often weak and vacillating, we saw day after day as the virus spread and we all went into lockdown, an extraordinary upwelling of generosity, ingenuity and creativity as people in every corner of the nation pulled together to help each other through the disruption. So the astonishing capacity of human beings to react well to a crisis is available everywhere, I think, to leaders who are trusted. And that is a lesson that will be vital in tackling the climate emergency. And the stakes couldn't be higher. If we fail to control our carbon emissions, life will change utterly and forever. There will be no return to normal or even near normal. And we know exactly what we need to do to keep the climate safe. Globally, we need to stop burning fossil fuels by the middle of the century at the very latest. And we know we can do that without depriving anyone of the energy we need for our lives and our economies. We already have the technologies we need to do this. And there are many more ways to use energy more efficiently that we haven't even begun to exploit. We also know that we can afford to make the energy transition. Bear in mind that 70% of all the fossil fuel we burn ends up as waste heat in any case, doing nothing for the economy. So the real barriers to keeping the climate safe will not be technology and there won't be cost. The real barriers will be the politics of change of a magnitude and pace unprecedented in history. Now, all changes benefit some people and disadvantages others. Change at the speed and scale we need to keep the climate safe will transform a huge number of lives. And understandably, those who think their lives will benefit will welcome the changes, and those who fear being disadvantaged will resist. One of the greatest obstacles to keeping the climate safe would therefore be a failure to guarantee a secure place in this green and fossil-free world that we're already building for those who are currently locked into high carbon jobs, those individuals and communities who risk losing out. We cannot and should not build a fossil-free future by creating another generation of the left behind. And that future must be constructed on the solid foundations of a thriving democracy. Only then will we create the conditions for the energy transition to be accompanied by a social transition as systematically thought through and as adequately resourced as the technology transition. And ensuring that happens is the responsibility of politicians. Now, we're already getting glimpses of what a world in which climate policy fails might look like. And it's not good for politicians, especially not democratic politicians. We can see now all too frequently how frequent fires, floods, droughts and storms disrupt the lives of tens of millions. And as temperatures continue to rise, so will the frequency of these disruptions. And as we've seen with the pandemic, disruption is unfair. It damages the poor more than the wealthy. And that's true within rich countries, as well as between the countries of the global north and south. As the climate crisis accelerates, the stress on societies everywhere will increase. Disruption will become commonplace. Social cohesion risks being undermined. Countries risk becoming ever less stable. Without climate security, maintaining food, water, and energy security becomes progressively more difficult, eventually impossible. Without food, water, and energy security, as we see in a growing number of failing states, political stability becomes impossible too. And in that process, it's all too easy for the populists to foment division, mistrust, and unrest, for the politics of secrecy, corruption, and repression to take hold. So the bottom line is this: democracy will not survive the chaos that will accompany climate policy failure. Now, I'm a Democrat by both conviction and profession. I believe it's not only the right way to govern, but it's also the best way. And it may well be the worst cliche, but Churchill was right when he famously said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Yet looking around the world, it seems as if there is a growing loss of confidence in democracy. Even among those concerned about climate change, there are some siren voices beginning to murmur that time's getting too short, the need for action too urgent, perhaps democracy is getting in the way. Well, they are wrong. And let me explain why they are particularly wrong with respect to climate change. Now, despots, to hold on to power, must destroy all the machinery that societies have developed to learn from their mistakes. A politically independent civil service and judiciary, a vibrant civil society, the right to organise and protest, academic and press freedom, unpoliticised public services, especially the police and military. And one of the reasons we need democracy and the machinery that makes it possible is simply that there is no mistake-free pathway to a net zero economy. So when we make mistakes, as we surely will, we have to be able to correct them quickly. And that means we must strengthen the societal machinery on which democracy depends and not weaken it. Now, that is the same machinery that allows political leaders to tap into and mobilise those deep wells of public response to crisis that I referred to earlier. And those wells are only accessible by governments that are trusted by their citizens. As despots destroyed the machinery of democracy, they destroy that trust. And without it, the scale and pace of change which a successful climate policy demands won't be supported, as it must be, by the choices people make in their daily lives. Now, democratic solutions to any problems are often untidy, they're incomplete, and they're messy, and they rarely please everyone. In a fast-changing world, the way we do democracy right now is too narrow, too slow, too timid, too centralised. I believe that democracy dies by neglect. It can't be taken for granted. It must be something which we actively defend and seek to grow. I find it really sad to read that growing numbers of young people no longer have confidence in democracy. I'm alarmed by the downward drift in turnout at elections. I'm worried by the way in which unregulated social media platforms are corrupting the forum of truth on which elections are fought. And I'm increasingly fearful that if we don't work hard to renew and revitalise our own democracy, we will lose it. And for all the reasons I've said, we will lose the battle against climate change as well. People neglect democracy when they feel their vote doesn't count, when they feel that a change in government is no change at all, when they feel their voice isn't heard. And so in conclusion, some of the things that we need to do to start restoring faith in democracy are pretty obvious. We need to have a fairer voting system, proportional representation to move us beyond our current elective dictatorship. We need to tackle intergenerational justice by giving 16-year-olds the vote. We need to replace the unelected House of Lords with a second chamber representing the nations and regions. We must modernize election law to prevent abuse through new technologies. We need to empower local government by decentralized decision-making and allowing it more fiscal freedom. We need to enshrine this enhanced machinery of democracy in a codified constitutional compact that doesn't leave issues of this importance in the hands of an overmighty executive or those with personal, political, or other agendas. And we need a significant expansion of the use of deliberative methods to help renew our ailing democracy, to grow engagement, trust, and consent as we tackle the climate emergency together. And the great thing about deliberation is there is now a wealth of evidence from around the world stretching back many years, both of its value as a process and as a source of good recommendations. Citizens' assemblies, like the recently convened Climate Assembly here in the UK, which I'm sure Becky will speak more about later. Citizens' juries, like legal juries, one of our few historic institutions that haven't come under sustained reputational attack. They rely on a simple and powerful assumption by the public, namely, if I had heard the same evidence, I would have reached the same conclusions. They can also help to provide a direct mandate, not only strengthening accountability, but legitimizing the kind of difficult choices that many politicians try hard to avoid. And when they've been used, it's encouraging that both citizens' juries or assemblies tend to support much bolder action and policies than governments have been prepared to countenance. The existential threat of the climate emergency is the most powerful case for a restoration of faith in democracy. And without a restoration of that faith, we cannot succeed in tackling the climate crisis. As I said at the start, we either keep both or we lose both. The world is changing and so must our democracy. Tackling the climate crisis is not something that can or should be done to people. It's something that should be done with people, giving them in the process, I hope, fresh agency and hope as well.
Thank you very much. Lots for us to think about there. Can I start just by asking about your own role as an MP? That you are the only Green Party MP. You are one in a chamber of 650, and you're operating, as you mentioned, in an electoral system that is very heavily weighted against a party like yours. So what is it that you feel that you can achieve as a member of Parliament? Why is it important for you, as someone who's fighting to combat climate change, to be in the House of Commons?
I think it helps broaden and widen the window of the possible. You know, some people call that the Overton window. In other words, if you've got a voice in Parliament, even if it's only one voice, I wish it were more, but even if it is only one voice, sometimes what you can do is to begin to pull the center of gravity a little bit further away from the direction you don't want to go into and a little bit closer to the direction that you do want to go into. Now, clearly one person in Parliament is not going to swing majorities, and on my own, I can't achieve anything. But what I can do, I hope, is to bring new issues onto the political agenda. And one of the big issues that I'm really trying to push onto the agenda right now is around the whole economic growth model. This is the elephant in the room, quite frankly, when we're having this climate debate. We cannot have a sustainable and green climate if we're continually pursuing the same model of economic growth that is based on ever more exploitation. Now, that is something that, frankly, hardly anyone else is speaking about. So I'm putting that on the agenda. But if I want to make some real success behind it, then I need to make alliances. And frankly, we are going to need political alliances for the climate crisis more than ever before. So I co-chair the all-party group on climate change, and I'm proud that there are people from all parties in that group. And of course, I try to press them to be more ambitious. That's my role. But also it's my role to reach out and make sure that we pull that center of gravity and get as many voices around it as we possibly can going forward.
And you've also served in the European Parliament. How effective do you think that assembly has been in approaching this issue?
Well, I think in those areas within the EU institutions where the Parliament had power, so it did have co-decision powers on environment in ways that it didn't have on, say, other home affairs issues. On those issues where it had co-decision powers, I think it was really effective and successful. And I think one of the tragedies of the UK leaving the EU, we haven't mentioned the word Brexit yet, so perhaps I can. I think one of the tragedies was actually that the UK globally had quite a good talk to talk. We were actually able to bring other EU countries with us. So we maximized our influence on the global stage. And one of the tragedies when it came to climate, I think, is that we've lost that bigger stage to push countries like Poland or Hungary or those countries that frankly would never have signed up to some of the targets that they finally did in the EU, were it not for countries like the UK really pushing them. So we've lost that stage, and that's a tragedy.
Well, thank you. There's lots of other issues that we'll come back to, I think particularly perhaps the analogy you made with COVID right at the start. But now I'd like to bring in our third panellist, who is Professor Rebecca Willis. So Rebecca holds a chair at the University of Lancaster and a fellowship in energy and climate governance. And she published a book last year that speaks very precisely to our subject today, called Too Hot to Handle: The Democratic Challenge of Climate Change. She was also previously the Vice Chair of the Sustainable Development Commission, so has experience of working with the UK government. And more recently, she served as an expert lead to the Climate Assembly UK. So she brings experience of a different kind of democratic decision making. So it's very good to have you with us. Thanks for taking part today, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. And, you know, I think what I heard from Caroline's talk and also from what Hilary was saying is something which I want to acknowledge outright, and that is the deep frustration from all of us who want to see progress on climate, including scientists, policy experts, campaigners, progressive businesses, this deep frustration that democratically elected governments are struggling to face up to the climate crisis. And of course, I share that frustration, having worked with governments for many years, including, as you said, as a government advisor. And I think the current government is a really good example of that, because they have a strong and I think genuine commitment to the net zero target, which is a result of that brilliant legislation that Hilary talked about, the Climate Change Act. So we see constant support for that target. And Boris Johnson on the steps of Downing Street when he was elected just over a year ago, it's been a long old year, but that was just over a year ago, reiterated his commitment to that target. And yet what we see is a government who are continually making decisions at odds with that pledge. So of course, the coal mine in Cumbria that Caroline mentioned, that I've been very closely working on, the decision just this week to lower air passenger duty, making domestic flights even cheaper in comparison with the trains. So this contradiction is something that really bothers me. And a few years ago, I decided to really get to the bottom of this. And I did a set of interviews as part of a research project with politicians from all parties to try and really uncover how politicians understand and respond to climate change. And even though I'd worked with politicians for many years, I was quite struck by the findings, particularly one of the findings that politicians didn't feel like they had a mandate from citizens to act on climate. And definitely when you compare what politicians were telling me and are still telling me with polling and research data, you see that politicians consistently underestimate levels of public support for climate action. So you have politicians often quite aware of the problem, but reluctant to speak out and develop that compelling agenda. And of course, that is not helped at all by the well-documented, very deliberate stalling tactics by powerful fossil fuel interests. So I think we've come to this situation where there's a sort of silent standoff. And on the one hand, you have citizens who are concerned, the research shows that, and want action, but they're discouraged by the inaction of politicians, which either leads to a deep cynicism in the democratic process, or a kind of confusion, a sort of contradictory sense of, well, you know, can it really be that much of a problem if politicians aren't speaking out? So that's on the citizen side. And then on the other side of that standoff, you have the politicians knowing that they need to act more decisively, but not being confident enough of support from their voters, from the electorate. So I've taken to thinking of this in terms of a breakdown in the social contract between citizens and state. And I'm slightly wary of saying that because I'm very aware that that's David's territory as a political theorist. So I'll be interested in his reactions to this. But, you know, in a very basic sense, the social contract is about about us doing collectively through the political system what we cannot do as private individuals. So we surrender a bit of our liberty in return for better collective action. That's absolutely at the centre of tackling climate change. But I don't think that social contract is there for climate. I think we've reached an impasse on that. And that's why the climate community, because of their frustration, can sometimes be tempted to turn away from democracy, to decide that it's not, that it's part of the problem, rather than really leaning into democracy. So the question that I want to ask is, what would happen if, rather than turning away, we really leaned into democracy, if we really focused on building that social contract between citizens and state on climate, if we really trusted people? And partly as a direct result of this research I mentioned with politicians, I got involved in developing plans for this incredible experiment that I was part of last year called Climate Assembly UK. And that was a citizens' assembly commissioned by Parliament, including the Environmental Audit Committee that Caroline sits on. And it brought together 108 citizens who were selected to be representative of the UK as a whole in terms of age, gender, socioeconomic background, ethnicity, what part of the country they lived in, and so on. They spent 4 weekends learning about climate change and what can be done about it, learning from experts and witnesses, deliberating, talking to each other, thinking it through, and then coming up with recommendations. It was 3 weekends in a hotel in Birmingham, then the last one happened online because COVID hit. But over that process, our citizens came up with a coherent strategy of how the UK should meet its carbon targets. And this is it. It's a huge thing. It's all on the website. And I'd really recommend diving into it, especially if you're interested in a particular aspect. One of the things they talked about was COVID recovery. And this, I think, in a way, is the social contract on climate change, because the conversations that we were able to have as part of the assembly were exactly that. What citizens would do under what conditions set by government. And what being involved in the climate assembly really crystallized for me is that if you give people the time and the space and the respect and allow them to learn and reflect, they come up with really sensible answers. And we've seen this time and time again in deliberative processes on all sorts of issues, but on climate, we've seen it as well as in the UK, in Ireland, France, lots of local areas, even Washington State in the US, where I've been helping them with their plans. The issue is, of course, that in something like a citizens' assembly, you can create that perfect dialogue between citizen and state. But you can only do that right there in the hotel in Birmingham in our case. And the challenge is, how do you recreate this kind of debate with 70 million, not just with 108? So let me end with a few pointers for how we might do that. The first is, as Caroline mentioned, using those citizens' assemblies and other deliberative processes to spark a wider debate. And as Caroline said, the same with legal trials, people tend to trust a process that's involved people like them, and there's good research to back that up. In France, they've done a bit better than that, a bit better than us, I think, in that their convention has sparked a wider debate and is now really influencing French climate policy. I think it's too soon to tell here, but we haven't seen quite such a solid response. I think part, though, of creating this deliberative system, what deliberative democratics theorists call a deliberative system rather than one-off processes, is also looking at the workings of politics, facing up to some of those questions around who has power and influence, rules on lobbying and transparency and so on. That's absolutely essential if we're to get this right. I think there's something to be said for experimentation, for trying different sorts of approaches. You know, there's quite a lot done on what would happen if we replaced the House of Lords with a body chosen through sortition, essentially through lottery, and we gave people the chance to serve in the House of Lords. And I also think we need a much wider social movement, and I use the term social movement with a bit of hesitation because it tends to be associated with the left. But I mean a social movement in terms of a broad-based story and engagement, which I think should be happening on the right as well as the left. But I'd say that the left have done a better job of it so far. But I think what this comes down to fundamentally for me is that we have to trust in people, because, you know, in the final analysis, no one, or, you know, maybe I should qualify and say vanishingly few people would vote for a world warmed by 3 degrees. That is just not something that, you know, the vast majority of people would want to see. So we need to find a way to renew that social contract, to trust people and give politicians the space to work with people to chart a way forward. And that is why, you know, in summary, we need more democracy and better democracy rather than less if we're going to tackle the climate crisis.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Can I start by asking about this issue of representation? Because you said at the start that clearly a lot of effort went into producing a climate assembly that was representative of different parts of the UK and of different groups within the UK. But I suppose it's usually been assumed that the best way to produce a representative institution is to allow people to vote for it. Is it really possible that an expert process can produce a more representative forum than our standard electoral procedures?
Well, I mean, in answering that, I want to come back to Hilary's challenge that, you know, we don't want to replace the representative chamber that we have. And I would completely agree with that. So I see deliberative processes like citizens' assemblies as providing better social intelligence for politicians to allow elected politicians to make their decisions better. And one of the ways that citizens' assemblies help with that is by providing really detailed, granular intelligence from people about how they live in their lives, what's important to them, and therefore how you can create a climate strategy that works for people. And you do not get that kind of intelligence from putting a cross on a piece of paper every 5 years. So I don't see it at all as a threat to the existing democratic system or a threat to the role of experts. I see it as a neglected extra ingredient in the process.
So just to clarify, we've had a number of questions in the chat and in the Q&A about whether assemblies of these kinds should ever be made binding, or their recommendations should be made binding upon government. Is your position that they should not?
So yeah, I think that in a representative democracy, I support representative democracy. I think that we should elect people to represent us. So I wouldn't suggest the kind of direct democracy where you override the elected politicians. I think you can do that if agreed by politicians on more narrowly defined issues. So, for example, in a very local example is, why not hand over a budget for youth recreation services to a young people's panel to decide how to spend, there's for the sake of argument £2 million to spend, give that to the young people to decide how to spend it, rather than expecting retired councillors to make good decisions. So I think on specific issues you could get some really good results, and that's why experimentation is really important. But in terms of the whole gamut of it, I'm not suggesting for a moment that you override representatives.
We had a speaker at the Mile End Institute a little while ago who had been very involved in citizens' assemblies in Ireland, and particularly on controversial subjects like abortion. And he was very positive about that experience, but he also sounded a note of caution about how they might work in the UK if they were used on scale and for fundamental political issues. And his concern was that in Britain, we have a very powerful, very polarized tabloid press, which is quite ruthless when it sees processes at work that it doesn't like. And that we might have to expect expert leads like yourself, or those organizing assemblies, or indeed those simply participating in them, to experience very serious interference in their private lives and scrutiny of their social media accounts and so on. Is that something that concerns you? And was that something that you talked about during the Citizens Assembly UK?
Yeah, I mean, we were really careful in Climate Assembly UK to make the process absolutely transparent. So I was one of 4 expert leads. They were designed to be balanced. We had an advisory group, which was, everything from the CBI through to Greenpeace, all shades of the political spectrum. Everything we did in terms of the debate and so on was publicly available. And we did get criticism, particularly from a small group of quite active climate deniers, but we could point to that absolute transparency in process. I think actually that I don't agree that they won't work here for those reasons, because I think that what you can do through deliberative processes like that is to actually take the debate away from those extremes, the kind of, climate campaigner versus climate denier false binary, and actually focus on, what normal people think. There's plenty of people who came to the Climate Assembly who, really hadn't been that involved in climate change before. Most people had heard of it, but it wasn't shaping their lives, or they didn't think it was. And so hearing from those people is one way to sort of break down those binaries and political divisions, I think.
Well, there's a very interesting discussion going on in the chat about what is representation and what is accountability and legitimacy. And I think that takes us very nicely to our final panelist, who is Professor David Runciman. David is Professor of Politics at the University of Cambridge and has a special expertise in thinking about democratic politics. Among many other books, he is the author of the optimistically named How Democracy Ends and The Confidence Trap, A History of Democracy in Crisis. He also co-hosts the Talking Politics podcast with Helen Thompson. And in 2019, he wrote an article for the journal Foreign Policy, which had the headline, which he may not have written, "Democracy is the planet's biggest enemy." So we're hugely grateful to you for coming, David, and the floor is yours.
I think we all know we don't write our own headlines. I didn't write that headline. So I want to broaden it out a little bit, and I hope what I have to say, and I'll try and be quite brief, touches on things that Hilary, Caroline and Rebecca have all raised, but in a way it goes back to where we started with Hilary and his response, Robert, to your questions. So I sometimes find myself thinking, if we lived in a political system, and when I say we, I mean in Britain, but more broadly, Western liberal representative democracies, that was inadequate to this challenge, how would it signal that? What would be the signs, the alarm bells? How would we know? And I sometimes think, well, it would look like this, that this is signaling to us that it's inadequate. A system in which I think the central political and more broadly social, economic challenge of our time is subject of a lot of words, but relatively little action, focus on long-term goals, but less immediate action, easily knocks down the political agenda by more immediate concerns, failures of coordination domestically and internationally, that this way of doing politics, for the reasons that we've all touched on and Rebecca particularly highlighted, there's that sense that it is telling us that it can't do this already. And yet at the same time, if you ask the question, what would it look like? How would it signal to us that it is up to the challenge? It might also look like this, for some of the reasons that Hilary mentioned. Climate is rising up the political agenda. Action is being taken. Public opinion is shifting. These long-term targets are real. And there are ways of holding governments to account as they move towards them. This same system can both be described as clearly to many people inadequate, and also it can be described as adaptive and responsive. And the case for the second is particularly, I think, readily made if you just argue, and I think I would, that representative democracy is inherently responsive. That's its point. And therefore, if it is going to adapt to a big challenge, it is by definition going to adapt late. I mean, that is a feature of democratic politics and the history of democracies. I've written about this in relation to a whole range of crises. You know, that other cliche about democracies is that they do the right thing in the end after they've done everything else first. And that's a feature of it. It's designed. That's what we mean by responsive, reactive. So I don't think there is an answer to the question, are we coping? Do we have a system that can do it? And therefore, I think the way to frame it is as a balance of risk. And the way I would put it is that there are two kinds of risks here. One risk is that it's not working, but we think it is. The other risk is that it is working and we think it isn't. And the second has real risks in it too, for the reasons Hilary said. Now, if we think we've got a democracy that is not up to the central challenge of our time, and we fundamentally change it, we have institutions that have a long history and established history. We have a shared understanding, even if the social compact is frayed around this issue. We have a pretty robust shared understanding about accountability, the role of elections and so on. You know, the mere fact that the 2019 election settled such a contentious issue as Brexit, which it did, is a sign that there is a shared set of understandings about how democracy works. And so to interfere with that has real risks associated with it. And yet, my sense is that if you think about the balance of risk, there are greater risks in thinking that it's working when it isn't than in thinking that it isn't working when it is. And I'd just put that in two ways, and then I'll stop. So one, I think relates to, and Caroline used this word. So we often, you know, we have history to draw on here. If we want to know how democracy works, we only have history. We don't have the future. But we have lots of evidence of democratic systems, you know, seeming to be on the ropes, but adapting and responding and reacting and so on. But there are reasons for thinking this challenge is unprecedented, and that there is a risk in thinking that the past will repeat itself. You know, we will get there in the end. This one might be unprecedented. I don't think it is. We might come back to the question of what we've learned from COVID. And you know, COVID has shown that governments can act quickly, decisively, and on a vast scale. But this is not like COVID for all the reasons we discussed. COVID came from nowhere, but it arrived on a day or in a week. This is long-term, this requires preemption. I think there's very little historical evidence that democracies are good at preemption. It requires potentially a prioritizing of issue in the face of immediate challenges. That, and you know, it's a painful conclusion to draw, that most often happens on a scale and with a level of coordination in wartime conditions. And actually, I think COVID more closely mimics wartime conditions than it does the threat of climate change. And if that's true, I mean, not least because it has a beginning and an end, it's a dangerous illusion to think that we are learning what governments can do in the face of this challenge. I'm not saying it's certain that it's unprecedented, but this is a balance of risk. And then the last point, which is the one I really feel strongly about, is that there are risks associated with fundamentally changing how we do our democracy. And all of the other panelists have talked about things that we can do, some more radical, some less radical. You know, sortition in the House of Lords, bigger role for citizens' assemblies. There are lots of things we can do, and I'll give an example in a second to highlight this point. And there's a feeling that if we tinker with our democracy, we are running big risks. And if we do more than tinker with it, if we not tear it up, but fundamentally reconfigure it, there are even bigger risks. And I'm not sure that we've got those risks right. And actually, I think one of the dangers of the last 4 years, and I think Donald Trump is not personally responsible for this, but I think the Trump phenomenon, which is that sense that we hold on to this democracy we've got, or the risk is authoritarianism, fascism, a return to the 1930s, you know, that it's this or the abyss. And that makes us small c very conservative about our democratic institutions. And the most striking feature for me about developed, sophisticated, enduring Western democracies is how conservative they become about their democratic institutions. And in the last few years, I think, you know, even for those who might think of themselves as you know, not on the conservative side of politics, there's that feeling that the risk to democracy is something that's fundamentally anti-democratic. And I think our democratic institutions are much more robust than that. And the risk is actually relatively slight in mature, well-established Western democracies of a collapse into something we might call authoritarianism. And I think actually in the United States, we've seen that. Donald Trump was not and is not the end of democracy. He's not even close to the end of democracy. The United States is not Hungary, never mind other places. It's more robust than that. We are more robust than that. We can take risks. I don't think it's as dangerous as people sometimes think. Experimentation, the word that Rebecca used, we're frightened of it when it comes to institutions. Why are we frightened of it? We hardly experiment at all. So I'll just give my one example, and I do it because it makes the point, although it often sidetracks the conversation. So I happen to believe that we should enfranchise children. So I happen to believe that the voting age, not 16, why not 6? I think if you go to school, you should get a vote. Why not? People are horrified by this suggestion whenever I make it. They're appalled by it's so reckless, so cavalier, so obviously destabilizing. They immediately hear it as me saying, I want 6-year-olds to be in the House of Commons. All I would be saying is that children should vote. And I think children vote for a whole range of reasons, including the climate issue, because the central divide in our politics on this is generational. And I think our politics is unfair. I think it's skewed because we are a rapidly aging society, and yet the people who are going to live with the consequences of this don't get the vote. And people might say, well, children aren't competent. Well, many people aren't competent. Who of us, who can say who's competent to vote? We don't ask that question. It's a right. Anyway, regardless of the merits of the argument, what really interests me is the horror, because it seems so dangerous, so risky, such a risky thing to do. I mean, even votes for 16 gets people pretty wound up. So 6 kind of sends people, I've given talks where people start hissing and throwing bread rolls at me. And I think it's mad because it's not dangerous. So dangerous is destroying our natural habitat. Dangerous is failing to even begin to be able to address the model of the economic models, as Caroline said, on which, in which we seem to be trapped. There are real dangers in this world, real risks that we're running. And changing the way we do democracy seems to me, on the balance of risk, not the biggest one. So whether that means taking seriously citizens' assemblies and empowering them, not just as advisory bodies. So the risk, as Hilary said, is that undermines the legitimacy of the House of Commons. There are risks there. I completely accept that. If we had the House of Lords done by sortition, there would be risks. It could really mess up the way we do politics. It might slow things down. It might be chaos. But I think that those risks are relatively slighter, even if not slight, than the risks of thinking that this way of doing politics might take another 10 or 20 years to rise to the challenge, but it eventually will. I think there is a risk there that it doesn't, and even 10 to 20 years is too long. And that risk seems to me to be greater.
Great, thank you very much. Lots of things that we can talk about. I don't think any bread rolls have arrived in the chat box yet, but
they will.
There's still time. So you talked about, you said that we only really have history to draw on when we're thinking about these kind of democratic questions. Now, in the 19th century, it would have been, I think, a fairly familiar idea to say that the shift from aristocratic government to democratic government, whatever its other benefits, made it harder for government to think long term. Because aristocracies are in a sense programmed to think across time, because you inherit your estate from the past, you transmit it to the future. Whereas democracy brings in a much wider range of decision-making voices among the living, but makes it harder to think beyond the current generation. Do you think that is a structural problem with democracy? And if it is there any way in which we can build in ways of enfranchising the future, if you like?
Apart from giving children the vote. I think it is a feature of democratic politics, but these are all balance of risk questions. So in the 19th century, it seems to me the balance of risk was clearly in favor of democracy, because yes, aristocracies might be better at long-term thinking, but they were much worse at short-term thinking. They were fundamentally non-responsive. And the most, it seems to me, obvious and unarguable case against non-democratic systems, which is democracies make, this is Tocqueville's argument, democracies make more mistakes than any other system, but they correct their mistakes. And non-democratic systems are much, much worse at correcting their mistakes. And so once you go down the wrong path in a non-democratic system, and we may see this in future in China and in other places, that we still have the advantage that though we mess up more often, we're also much more aware of when we mess up. So then it seems to me the argument for democracy would be overwhelming if we were living in an aristocracy. And I'm not arguing against democracy. I'm arguing for experimenting with it and not being small c conservative about its institutions. And that does involve, it's a big challenge to bring in longer term thinking. And we could be both more democratic and less democratic with our institutions. We could have, I mean, Caroline suggests this, we could have more science in there legitimated as a means of making political decisions. As it were, we could have a more scientific democracy, and we could democratize science. You know, one of the great things about the possibility of deliberative politics is to bring scientists together with voting publics and have them engage directly around decisions and even maybe reach collective decisions. And we haven't seen much of that this year. I mean, one of the striking things about this year is that there have been arguments about the role of science, but our democratic encounters with scientists have been in the form of a few people speaking to us at press conferences. It's not been particularly democratic. We could be much more democratic than that. But it is a challenge, no question. But I should say I'm not one of those people who thinks, you know, the Chinese political system is going to win because it's better at long-term thinking than we are. I think the Chinese political system is probably better at making long-term bets, and it's almost certainly worse at knowing what to do when they're the wrong bets.
Thank you. Another issue that you've written about extensively is the rise of populism in democratic politics. And a feature of populism seems to be a suspicion of expertise, a conviction that science is a hoax, a willingness to challenge the motives of those who make scientific arguments, and partly because of that, a willingness to dismantle environmental protections. How do we explain that link between populism and scientific cynicism, and what can we do about it?
I mean, it's a huge question. I spent 5 years on a project in Cambridge studying conspiracy theories, and by the time we finished, we had, not least, there was a conspiracy theorist in the White House. We had too much material to draw on, and it's only got worse. But I think there is also a question, I don't want to reiterate this point too much, but there's a sort of balance of risk issue here. Those frustrations with the democracies that we have, though they're functioning well in many ways, clearly have in recent years produced a kind of reaction which includes deep cynicism, not just skepticism, but cynicism about expertise, and has fueled some of these arguments. And a huge challenge to democratizing in a more broader sense is how to include those voices. I mean, maybe Rebecca can talk a bit about this. I mean, she talked about the challenge of, you know, climate deniers and the role of the Citizens Assembly, and how you do make sure you have, you know, you're representing all voices, including all those people who are sick to the back teeth of being told by people with university degrees, you know, how they should think. And it has to include everybody. But it's definitely a rising feature. We haven't talked at all about information technology. We haven't, you know, in a way it's good. We haven't got sucked into an argument about whether this can be blamed on social media and so on. But this is a very challenging environment in which to do democratic politics. We're living in a world that's both in many ways more democratic than it's ever been because of our access to information, our ability to communicate with politicians directly, to complain, to rage, and less democratic in many ways because we don't have any democratic control over that technology, very little, relatively speaking. It's hugely challenging. But for me, all of these are reasons for thinking, if we're going to make that judgment, is this really working for this challenge versus should we think about making some significant changes? The signs to me are stronger that it's not working than that it is. And that's one of them.
Thank you. So at this point, I'd like to open out the discussion to the panel as a whole, and there are questions flooding in. So I'm going to try and bunch some of them together. And then I'll ask each of you in turn, perhaps not to respond to everything that I've raised, but to pick up on whatever you think is most interesting or you would most like to respond to. So firstly, a point that many of you have made in your remarks is about the importance of trust. If we're going to tackle climate change, we have to be able to trust climate science, and we have to trust our leaders, and that's important to the responsiveness of democracy. And yet we seem to live in a moment when trust in democratic politics is at very low levels, and in which some political actors seem keen deliberately to drive down levels of trust. So what can we do to rebuild the trust that climate action requires? A second set of questions are around the analogy with COVID, which David has touched upon. And one question is about whether it is possible to replicate something like SAGE, that SAGE is a really interesting example of the way that scientific expertise has become mainstream in political decision-making and has helped to build democratic consent. Could we envisage a kind of climate SAGE? And then thirdly, a number of questions about international action. We've talked a lot about our national democracies. Is there any way in which we can democratize international decision-making, given that ultimately this is only going to be effective if action is taken on a planetary scale? So 3 very large questions there. Perhaps we could go in the same order. So Hilary Benn, would you like to begin?
Oh, crumbs, that's a whole other hour and a half, you know. God, this is such an interesting discussion. I was just thinking, we asked the interesting question, Robert, can democracies ever legislate for the long term? And I wouldn't be quite so pessimistic. After all, why have we got national parks? Because actually a post-war government that had plenty on its plate, like a fuel crisis, huge debt, made a conscious decision to legislate to preserve beauty for posterity. Now, okay, I may appear to be just arguing the cause of elected representatives, but we shouldn't undersell it. And I suppose it links to your first question about trust, because the evidence that I've seen, politicians, what do you think of the standard of education? Maybe differently now when you say, what do you think of, the NHS? You get a different answer than if you ask them, what is your MP like, or your councillor? What's your child's school like? What was your last experience of the NHS like? Now, the latter is based on personal perception and experience, and the former is based on what people think is everybody else's experience. And that then goes to the heart of this debate about how we hold up a mirror to ourselves as a society and reflect back what is and what isn't happening or going on. And Donald Trump, oh God, that time was so difficult. I would just say in response to you, David, that democracies really have a hard time in trying to function if there's a raging argument going on about who actually won an election. I really felt for the counters, the loyal public servants in all the states who did their job, which is to count the votes. The idea that Caroline would ring up the returning officer in Brighton and say, oi, can you just find me another 11,000 votes? That's all I need from you. I mean, it's just, and we kind of sit there and go, oh, well, that's Donald Trump for you. I mean, what is going on? And I also think that social media and the fact that people now consume information and live their lives in totally separate ways is also a great challenge. When people write to us, as I'm sure people write to Caroline saying, COVID doesn't exist, the hospitals are empty, it's all a lie, you're trying to introduce a police state, blah, 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 blah. And the longer this has gone on, to be honest, I get more irritated with people because folk are dying and we're working really hard to try and cope with this. And it is the atomization of our society that has occurred. As the pace has increased enormously in my lifetime. When I was born, tells you how old I am, there was one television channel. One. There were a lot of radio stations and there were lots of newspapers, but and people now live their lives in completely different ways. I knock on doors and people are watching the television of the country from which they originally came. That's the news they're interested in. They're not watching Sky, BBC or anything else. So that, I think, is a challenge for trust. The climate SAGE, that's a really interesting idea. In a way, you've got the Intergovernmental Panel, you've got the Climate Change Committee, you've got the voice of scientists. And of course, in dealing with COVID, we've learned that there isn't a science. People say, I am following the science. Well, there isn't one science. Scientists, believe it or not, can have as many different views on what the right thing to do is as politicians can. Thirdly, international democracy. Ultimately, each government is going to have to, well, hopefully will be accountable to its own. China's an interesting example because it seems to me the deal in China is the government and the system delivers economic growth, which goes to the point that Caroline was making earlier. And in return, you don't shout too much at us about how we get there. If economic growth disappears in China, well, it'll be interesting to see how the system works. But secondly, when the Chinese government decides to do stuff, oh boy, do they do it at scale and fast. And we're seeing that with some of the steps they're taking in relation to the climate emergency. And the final point I wanted to make was reflecting on what you said, David, about, you know, where is our democracy on climate change at the moment? If you ask politicians what are they most worried about at the moment, part of the answer will come from what are people asking them about. So if we, when I go back to my email and discover, as all of us do, and it was just nothing but you are failing on climate, you're not doing this, you're not doing that, I think you would find the political system more responsive to the cry, hey, we need to speed up. And therefore, I really welcome what you said, Rebecca, about leaning much more into the political system and say, oi, we want you to work to achieve this. And if we're going to raise the profile of it, and if the surveys show that the public is much more up for change, please express it to us.
Great. Thank you very much. Caroline, would you like to come in now?
I was just thinking how topical this question of trust is, because the Speaker in the House gave a remarkable reminder to MPs just earlier today, and that was that he was asking MPs to tell the truth and to correct mistakes. And the reason he had to do that was because yesterday the Prime Minister stood at the dispatch box and claimed that Labour had voted in a way that it absolutely hadn't. And the week before, he had claimed that that all of the PPE contracts were in the public domain, and they weren't. And that is massively damaging to trust. I've tweeted it earlier, and the story that goes with it is actually from the Mirror. It says election debate audience bursts out laughing as Boris says the truth is important. So, you know, we can be very condescending looking at the US, but I think we should be a bit worried about what's happening on our own doorstep as well. I wanted to pick up something that David said when he said that representative democracy is inherently responsive. I would say is eventually responsive, and I know you said that too, but I think it matters, the time lag matters when we're dealing with something like the climate emergency, and I think that's what makes this just so qualitatively different. You know, it's said that winning slowly when it comes to climate change is the same as losing, and I'm very worried that that is where we're at. That was Bill McKibben saying that. There is such a thing as being too late, and unless we change, I would argue, our democracy to make it genuinely more representative, and in my terms that would mean some kind of proportional representation, then that sense that your democracy is responding, it's just not going to be there in any meaningful way. You know, we can look at the whole issue of safe seats, and, you know, going back to the whole MPs expenses scandal, there was a clear correlation between MPs who were in the safest seats and therefore least likely to be challenged, and the degree to which their expenses were falling into the public scrutiny. So to raise levels of trust, we need to, I would argue, have a more responsive electoral system. I think we need media regulation, and we've not talked much about the media so far today, but they have a very big part to play. Social media and the fact that we are losing that kind of shared understanding of at least what the facts are, even if we might then draw different conclusions from them. So there are things we can do about it, but the first step is to recognise that we've got a problem, and I'm not sure that everybody has. On the stage for climate, I was going to say pretty much the same as Hilary. I mean, we've got the Committee on Climate Change. But it's interesting that with SAGE, you've got SAGE and you've also got independent SAGE. And frankly, I take a lot of notice about what independent SAGE say. And it points to what Hilary was saying, that there's not one single scientific truth. There are different scientific views, and there are majorities of scientific views, but nonetheless there are challenges and so forth. And I think the same will be the same, not in terms of the actual climate science, but in terms of its interpretation and the extent to which feedback loops are taken into account in terms of some estimates and aren't in others. So I think we probably need a proliferation of voices out there that are making science more comprehensible to people, because I think the difficulty with the Committee on Climate Change is, you're not going to put that in front of your citizens' assembly in a completely unmediated way. I wouldn't have thought you would want someone there to try to unpack it. And we need to find ways of doing that. They aren't just limited to 108 people in Birmingham, but across the field. Very last thing to say. We talked a little bit about how do you take into account the views of future generations, and I just wanted to use that as an opportunity to give a shout out for my private members bill, which is a well-being of future generations bill, which I'm trying to get through Parliament. Lord Bird is putting it in the Lords. I'm doing it here. We're building on the Welsh example and the pioneering work of Jane Davidson in the Welsh Assembly. But it's cumbersome. There aren't any easy ways of doing this, but it is a way of trying to make sure that decisions have some kind of screening for their impact on future generations, not just on the next focus group.
Thank you very much. Rebecca Willis.
Thanks. I just let me loop back to something Hilary said about his post bag, or inbox, as I suppose it now is, and it strikes me that we maybe haven't had as much progress over the last couple of years as climate advocates like to think, in that politicians still are not getting the message, and definitely it seems like inboxes are not actually in line with with research on public opinion on this. So I would just say, given that we've got a lot of people listening to us, go and see your MP. And there's a brilliant charity called Hope for the Future who give you resources on how to talk to politicians, just even the logistics of how to start a conversation. So I'd really recommend people doing that. And that takes me on to the question about populism, actually, because what we've seen with populist demagogues like Trump and Bolsonaro and so on is very cynical exploitation of this lack of trust that some people have in elites or experts, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy under that kind of populist regime. And you could see that same, that same problem about trust in authority and elites and turn it into a completely different direction, which is, okay, let's let people like us make the decisions. That's what you do through something like Citizens Assembly. There's a really interesting discussion in the US about giving people, having a sort of process by which everyone gets to spend an hour a week discussing, every politician has like an hour a week set aside for discussion with a randomly generated section of their constituents. And they did the maths on how long it would take for everyone to then have that conversation. And it would mean that actually you're quite likely to be able to talk to your representative at some point, at some point, and that then you start seeing your friends doing that as well. And so it's a completely different sort of culture develops. I think there's all kinds of things like that we could do. Just on COVID, I won't repeat the stage discussion, but I mean, just to say that COVID for me is fundamentally not an allegory for climate action, especially in terms of, reducing air travel and so on, because it's about immediate sacrifice, living apart from everyone. And instead, I think the lesson from COVID is that we need a really good functioning state to take decisions that we can't make on our own. And it's a much broader lesson about the importance of collective decision making, and that isn't even a left-right thing. That is, some basic stuff around safety, which we really need to learn in order to deal with the climate crisis. And lastly, on the global point, I mean, I actually think that maybe climate politics has been a bit too global, in that it's a lot of elites flying around the world. And there's a question which we might not get to from Malini Mehra about, do we actually need to focus much more on, place-based politics, on, jobs and transport in constituencies and so on? And I would say absolutely yes, because it's by localizing the climate discussion and by looking at, zero carbon industrial strategies in areas like West Cumbria, who at the moment want jobs in a coal mine. That is how we get it. It's having that sort of fine-grained, very localized responses that people can relate to. So of course you need the global, but I actually think that the global and local will become more important in this debate, weirdly, than the national level.
Thank you, and David.
So I just want to say something connecting the first and the third question about trust and about international. So trust is quite demanding. People talk about trust a lot. It's a difficult word. I think some people find it off-putting because it sounds like it is asking a lot. There's an uglier word, a more sort of academic-y word, but I think it's just as important, which is legitimacy. Just what makes decisions or assemblies or people taking decisions legitimate. That is what allows the people who don't agree with them to accept nonetheless that they are allowed to decide. And that's what Trump challenged with his, when accept the result of the election. I mean, trust was almost a secondary issue. I think we'd moved beyond trust. It was, legitimacy. And in the end, actually, the system held. And I think, the trust for international politics is probably too demanding. But I was really struck by, I've just read and reviewed Jonathan Sumption's new book. He's now known as a sort of lockdown skeptic. Not going to talk about that. Given his political attitudes, I was slightly surprised to discover he was a Remainer and not a Leaver. And he said there's only one reason he's a Remainer, literally just one, why he thought Britain should and should rejoin probably the European Union. And that is, at some point, given the range of challenges that we face, of which climate is preeminent, but many, many challenges that are to do with an interconnected world, we will have to have legitimate international institutions whose decisions are accepted by national electorates. And if we don't, the game is over. Like that is throwing in the towel. At some point, we will have to do that because these challenges we face, particularly around climate, will require some forms of legitimate international decision-making. And I think that, I have to say, I agree with him. And I think we don't talk quite enough about that, though it's important politics should be local and grounded, and there's so much we could do. But at some point, we are still a long way, I think, from getting there, that legitimacy for international institutions, as seen from national electorates and national legislatures, is a real challenge, and that is important. Last thing on the point everyone's touched on, the sort of post-bag issue and the fact that politicians, as Hilary said, if we were out there saying, do something, you would do it. So there is a kind of signaling game in representative democracy. I think electorates wait to hear from the politicians that an issue is important, and politicians wait to hear from the electorate that an issue is important. And in COVID, that dynamic worked quite well. Actually, they sort of signaled to each other quite effectively, I think, and Sumption is wrong for that reason. But on this issue, it's working really badly. There's a kind of waiting game. So I say we here as a voter. So we're waiting to hear from you that it's really important, and you're waiting to hear from us that it's really important. And for all the reasons Caroline said, we can't wait that long. And if we are stuck in that dynamic at the moment, we've got to break the loop. And I think we should break the loop by doing democracy in lots of different ways.
Thank you. We've got about 4 minutes left. So I'm naughtily going to try one more round. If I could ask you to be very brief and perhaps just respond to one of these questions. So firstly, we've got a question from Jack Newman and others. What's the role of local and regional democracy here? We've got a question from Roger Lewis. How do we tackle the influence of big money on our democracy and the money and the fossil fuel companies? From Kelly McBride, given that governments are always judged on how successfully they handle the economy, how do we perhaps decenter the role of GDP and think differently about what a good economy actually is? So if perhaps we go in reverse order. David, is there anything you would like to respond to there?
Those are huge questions. I mean, I think the money issue is clearly a big question. I mean, it is true that one of the features of representative democracy is that when it goes a little wrong, and I think this is particularly true in the United States, it can be captured. And we're aware of that. We focus on it. It's another of these issues that comes and goes up the political agenda. I think we're not in the American position in relation to that, but of course we're certainly not immune to it. All of these questions are hard ones to kind of keep centrally focused when there's so much else going on. I mean, after all, one thing we have learned around COVID and the pandemic is a lot of these issues about money and capture and how we actually, allow governments to take decisions and who gets the money in the end are not particularly democratic, and that's on an even greater scale with climate. We probably have to pick our battles. I don't think in the UK that's our number one battle. I think if I was an American citizen, I might think that is the number one battle.
I actually wanted to choose the money question as well, because I think it's, if you see, I mean, it's so central to the climate debate, both in a, you know, if you look at the, and there's some brilliant work done by Naomi Oreskes and others on, you know, very forensically unpacking the influence of the oil majors on climate politics. And it's absolutely, it's astonishing. And we address this in Climate Assembly. And in fact, it's something that I argued for as one of the expert leads, that we should deal with questions of power and influence in the Climate Assembly. And that felt quite difficult. It felt sort of very political compared with, oh, which renewable technology should we have? It felt very a political thing to do. And we had this discussion about whether, and anyway, to cut a long story short, I ended up being the person who had to do that. And so I was really careful to base it on, you know, peer-reviewed evidence. And even so, it felt a really difficult thing to talk about. We've got to get away from this being a difficult thing. It's got to be front and centre. We've got to ask all the time, why are people backing this position? Where's the money here? Can we see the audit trail? Where's the transparency? And I think that isn't, you know, and that isn't a controversial thing to say, or it shouldn't be a controversial thing to say, I should say.
Thank you. Caroline Lucas.
Well, thank you to Kelly for giving me the opportunity to say something more about the growth issue, because, you know, governments are thinking that net zero by 2050 is a reasonable target. We can discuss that. I don't think it's fast enough, but nonetheless, net zero by 2050. If you bear in mind that over that same 30 years, the global economy is due to either double or treble in size, somewhere between those two, then the job of decarbonizing that extra amount is just eye-watering. It is going to be hard enough to decarbonize the economy the size it is now, let alone if it's 2 or 3 times larger. And at this point, somebody comes in and says, oh, well, don't worry, we're going to decouple resource use from emissions. Well, there is plenty of examples of where you can do some limited decoupling. And of course, you should do it where you can. And energy efficiency can help us, and technological change can help us. But there is no example anywhere in the world of decoupling happening fast enough, comprehensively enough, and on the scale required. And that means we are going to have to get away from thinking that the function of our economy is to deliver more and more GDP growth. The good news is that there are more and more people out there in this space. The Dasgupta report, interestingly commissioned by our own Treasury, itself says that GDP is not a terribly helpful long-term metric to be using. The OECD is working in this space. The European Environment Agency has done some fantastic work. But what we need to do is to stop commissioning more work and actually start making sure that the next statement that the Chancellor gives has some other indicators rather than just this very, very blunt and crude indicator of GDP growth alone.
Thank you. And finally, Hilary Benn. You're still on mute.
Mute. There we are. There we are. Look, I'm picking up Caroline's last point. I'm in favour of a broader measure of, you know, what is progress and what is a good economy, but that will never change. We've got to get the numbers down, and that is a practical task. I wanted to pick up the first of those questions, which is the balance between the local, the national, and the international, because it seems to me the great sort of struggle in politics at the moment is between, on the one hand, the desire for more control, self-determination, independence. You see that expressed in lots of different ways. And on the other, the absolute necessity, as I see it, of collaboration above the nation state to deal with the problems that the world is facing, climate change being a perfect example of it. And it's about balance. And I think the Brexit referendum was 52% saying we don't think we quite got the balance right. And we know from our ecological systems that really big things can flow from really quite small changes in the balance. And the second thing is, I'm a great supporter of devolution. I would echo everything that Caroline said in her opening remarks about changes that we want to see. Because if we give more people locally the tools to make the change, then you've added to the total capacity of the political system to respond. You're not just waiting for Parliament. And to take a very practical example, vehicles and CO2, it's so striking how the debate about air quality, basically your dirty or my dirty car is killing somebody else's children or causing respiratory disease, is helping to create the space in which we can say, look, people need their mobility, because this is not about taking people's mobility away for a whole host of reasons, but it is about changing the way in which they get about. And there's one example, traffic schemes and national regulation on what kind of engines, power cars and so on. There's one example of how you can begin to turn things around and make the change. And I remain an optimist because really the alternative doesn't bear contemplation.
And that's a very good note, I think, to end on. We could go on for hours, and I must say there's an absolutely fabulous discussion going on in the chat box and in the Q&A. So thank you to everybody who's participated in that. And I'm sorry that I couldn't get through more of your questions. But I just want to end by thanking all of our panelists for a really interesting and stimulating discussion. Thank you to Hilary Benn, Caroline Lucas, David Runciman, and Rebecca Willis, and to all of you for coming today. Please do sign up to our mailing list. We've got lots more interesting and exciting events to come. And you can also find recordings of all of the previous events in this series on the future of British democracy on the Mile End Institute website. So thank you for taking part in the discussion today, and we hope to see you back with us again before long. Bye.